If you've been paying attention lately, you'll have noticed that the KOSPI saw a bit of resistance last week, dipping from its former high of 3152 to 3013 last Monday, January 18th, before climbing up to a new high of 3160 on Thursday. Had you not been paying attention, you may not have noticed this volatility at all. In fact, one less knowledgeable than you might assume that the score would have gone up in light of the lowered number of daily COVID cases since that day. But since you watched our last video on market scores currently available through the link in the top right corner, you know that the stock market doesn't reflect the day-to-day changes to the overall economy. So what can we learn from stock market index scores? Well, that's what we're talking about today. You're watching Sekkider, and this is the second part of our discussion on KOSPI scores and index scores in general. Today we're going to answer the question, what can we learn from an index score? Now before we continue, this is just a reminder that this channel is primarily meant for educational purposes and aims to develop a better understanding of our local stock market, as well as the resources available to us as we aim to improve our lives in the Republic of Korea. Now let's get to it. To summarize the first part of this series, the main point of index scores is to measure the weighted average cost of all of the shares within a market's index. Thus, market index scores primarily aim to measure one part of the wider economy rather than the economy as a whole. By comparing the market against its historical scores, we can see how much a market has grown or receded over time. The market index score is best used to compare itself against, itself. While the wider economy and index scores do share some correlations, their relationship is not necessarily causative, as a large majority of people do not spend their time or money on stock picking or even investing at all. What stock market index scores are excellent at telling us is investor sentiment and overall activity within a given market. This is important for investors since the ultimate goal of investing is to grow wealth and protect from inflation. The savvy investor places their money in places that are best fit for growth, and the even savvier understand the imperative to look at historical precedent when deciding where those places may be. Now, to understand this more clearly, I'd like to evoke George Soros' theory of reflexivity in markets. George Soros is a Hungarian investor whose theory of market reflexivity grew his wealth to billionaire status, and for some reason a bunch of American neocons also believe he's the three-headed Cerberus ushering in an era of fire and brimstone based on historical philanthropy towards people's movements and anti-authoritarian causes, but we're not going to get into that today. Anyways, Soros' theory is based on the general concept of reflexivity that purports that cause and effect are not linear but biodirectional. Thus, causes exert forces on effects, and effects exert forces on causes. Now, we're not going to go into the sociological foundations of reflexivity into this video because that's not really what this channel is about, but we are going to discuss how markets can exhibit reflexivity and how they can be represented in stock market scores or market scores overall. Now, two fundamental aspects of reflexivity are an understanding that there are two types of reality. You have an objective reality and a subjective reality. Now, objective reality relates to a tangible, factual reality. An example of this may be to say that the KOSPI score closed at 3140 on January 22nd. Another objective statement may be to say that the unemployment rate was 4.1% in December of 2020. These statistics are objective fact, and therefore unchangeable regardless of what we choose to believe. On the other hand, subjectivity relates to what a person chooses to believe or what a person or persons think about certain facts. So while one person may believe that the KOSPI is at its peak and will only begin to crash from this point on, another person may believe that this is just a sign of the world waking up to how undervalued the Korean market really is. If the majority of people think the former, the market will more than likely begin to drop as profit taking begins to prove them right. If the majority of people think the latter, then the stock market score will continue to rise as they continue to funnel their liquid capital into the markets. Now, if the market continues to grow and those invested in it start to shift from one belief to another, it may meet resistance as those with positive outlooks shift to negative outlooks. Thus, Soros states, financial markets, far from accurately depicting all of the available knowledge, always provide a distorted view of reality. This is the principle of fallibility. The degree of distortion may vary from time to time. Sometimes it's quite insignificant, at other times it's quite pronounced. Ultimately then, the market score is always a reflection of the difference between consumer beliefs and economic reality, and can be used as a way of measuring investor sentiment around the stock market. Now, of course, there are ways for individual companies to take advantage of booming stock prices, such as securing larger loans with a larger market cap, attracting greater talent, or benefiting from employee stock issuance programs that pay the employee a lot, considering that the stock price continues to go up. But if we look at full index scores, as broad as they are, they may not benefit from these same types of maneuvers pulled off by companies individually, unless it's happening across the entire market. Now I'm going to try to demonstrate the correlation between market scores and economic reality by looking back at Shoetown from part 1. Before, we talked about how a market can grow as a location's economy grows. But now we're going to talk about how it can go down and how that might also affect the market score. Now imagine there's a market downturn in Shoetown. The companies that once garnered the most attention in the market may no longer find it economical to continue to hire so many people. Maybe the workers are being phased out by technology, or maybe their products are selling less as the whole market sinks and people stop buying things that they don't need, or even spending on services they can't afford. Who knows? Either way, with less future earnings in sight, investors decide to cash in on their shares. This drops the share prices across the market. As the share prices drop, the ability for the underlying companies to raise funds through new equity drops. And we got to remember that people, employees, have mobility. So if they want to leave the town to look for other employment, they can do so. In an effort to save their stock price, companies could cook their books and maybe buy back some shares to make it look like the shareholder value is increasing. But that would be a really bad use of their free cash flow, since their future is clearly uncertain. Now, if it gets bad, we see what we've seen in crashes across history. You get a large rise in unemployment, which in turn often leads to two things. First, you get larger cutbacks on spending as people aim to stretch their money for as long as possible, since they don't know where their next source of income will be. Second, you get stock sell-offs as people aim to cash in on their investments, protect themselves from further losses, and bolster their savings. Lower liquidity and an increase in financial uncertainty for the retail investor leads to less public investment and a further drop in market scores. In this way, the socioeconomics of a society during a market downturn directly affect the overall market average scores. The material effect of the market downturn on the formerly employed, but now unemployed, directly affects their ability to continue investing in the market. And that's even before considering the psychological effects that seeing market scores drop can have on a retail investor in charge of their own investing practices. Now, although we can draw a direct line of this downfall in stock market score to its real-world causes, this is not necessarily true in reverse. And that's because market downturns restrict retail investors' abilities to spend, both in real life and in the market. In that way, we see companies taking losses on two fronts. However, in times of prosperity, the average person still has the choice of whether or not to commit their free capital to the market, so even if the economy rises back up, if consumer confidence in these markets do not improve, then we don't see that much movement within the market itself. So, why then have markets been on vicious bull runs while the underlying socioeconomics have been crumbling in the wake of the coronavirus? Well, it's the very nature of the modern economy that's made it so. See, the coronavirus has only really led to unemployment in industries that cannot make up their losses with a shift to digitization. Think of things like the service industry or small-sized retailers. Now, in the past, where a large number of jobs were based on manual labor, this wasn't the case. But with most industries able to maintain their operations and reduce layoffs through work-from-home solutions like video conferencing, more people were able to retain their jobs during lockdowns. With less ability to spend their money on goods and services, little to no impact to their cash flows, and the growing awareness that it's best to invest while the market is down rather than shy away, retail investors have been flooding towards the market instead. Combine that with the interest rates and bond returns being as low as the floor, and those not facing existential threats or employment issues don't have any better place to squirrel away their dough. It's actually this specific change that's led to the K-shaped recovery that we're seeing now, where some parts of the economy are sinking while others have recovered quickly and started booming. But, as you'll note, that particular aspect has more to do with reality than it does to do with the markets. Now, the main thing to take away from these videos is this. The relationship between markets and the economy are corollary but not necessarily causative. The concept of reflexivity dictates that stock prices may be able to drive real-life growth if trends catch up to the hype. But this may not necessarily be the case currently, and in the modern economy, the correlations are even more muddled than ever. You can have strong economies that have really bad markets, and you could theoretically have really bad economies that have really strong markets. So the market's booming while the unemployment rate is rising and national household debt are rising as well should not be too surprising when we consider how the black swan event that led to this market downturn has disproportionately affected those with money and those without, and those within certain industries as well as those outside of those industries. And whether we like it or not, this is pretty much by design. There's a reason why most people's movements have tended to be anti-capitalist over the course of history. As Jack Bogle said, capitalism is about creating capital for the capitalists. No more and no less. Ultimately, there is no profundity inherent to a stock market score. It simply measures what it's meant to measure, the volume of money in a given index. While it does hold relevance to the greater economy as a whole, using the score alone as a way to make a point on the health of a wider economy, whether for or against, has never been more misguided. Alright, that's it for me today. Hopefully you learned something useful. If so, please show us a little love and scroll down and hit the like and subscribe buttons. Come back next week where we'll get into more practical financial tips to help you get your money right in the Republic of Korea. Invest responsibly, do your research, take it easy.